Well, hello and welcome back to a brand new season of The Brief. We hope that you had a wonderful holiday break if you were able to take some time off. We're really excited to be back for another season, exploring the big challenges that we as Albertans face and sharing the big ideas that make this province the best place to live. And as it has become tradition on this podcast, we're kicking off the season with renowned pollster Janet Brown to peer into the minds of Albertans and share her insights on how Albertans are feeling to start off the year. So on the agenda, we're talking about the effects of affordability on households, people's perceptions of healthcare reform and some other recent policies, and thoughts on migration to the province as Alberta nears 5 million, and so much more. So if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show.
Well, welcome to 2024, and we're here for what I think is the third year in a row with our good friend, Alberta pollster Janet Brown, also known as the Oracle of Inglewood, my favorite name for you, to talk a bit about how Albertans are feeling this year going forward as sort of the calendar page flips over. And I often say, I think I said something similar to this last year, but I think of public opinion, which is your area of expertise, as kind of like a compass that can help point you in the right direction. And that's true whether you're in public policy or politics or in business. If you kind of know the mood of the public and what's keeping people up at night, that can help guide a lot of decisions in the right direction. And so, I don't know what you do in your household, Janet, but in ours every year, somewhere around New Year's, we sit down and we think about the year ahead and we sort of take stock of the past year. Britt, I know that you have described you do something similar as well. We look at the year ahead and we set some intentions, some goals. We talk about what we're excited about and what we're worried about. So I'm wondering, because I know you were in field not that long ago, shortly before the new year. Take us into, to the extent that you can, to the dining room tables of Albertans as the calendar was flipping over. What were they talking about in terms of their hopes and dreams for the year ahead and their fears as well?
Well, I'm guessing that Albertans weren't talking very much about politics over dinner over Christmas season. And the reason I say that is because it was such an intense political year in 2023. With the provincial election, with all the craziness that went around that. So I get a sense right now from my own polling that Albertans kind of have this attitude of, okay, we had the election, we took our bruises, we're getting past it, let's just get on with it. Let's let the new government govern. Let's just get on with it. So I think I think the political temperature has turned down quite a bit. But as I look at the calendar, when I switch the calendar, for somebody who's so focused on provincial politics, I turned the calendar and the first thing I thought was, a year divisible by 4. That means it's a leap year. And when it's a leap year, that means we get a Summer Olympics. And that means we get a U.S. presidential election. Right. Those are all the things that line up with a leap year. And so that's actually what I was thinking about as the year changed. U.S. presidential election, how does that impact our federal politics? And then how does it impact our provincial politics?
So do you think that's something that Albertans are thinking about right now? Are they thinking about U.S. federal politics? Or is that just where your mind is kind of going to?
No, I don't think people are. I mean, I genuinely think Albertans are just trying to take a bit of a political detox right now. And if anything, maybe Albertans are wondering about the federal scene and how things are going to turn out with the federal election. But actually, no, I don't think the U.S. presidential election is on too many Canadians' radar screen at this time. But very soon, we're already hearing some interesting news coming out of the U.S. about Donald Trump's ability
to contest the election.
To contest the election and all of those things. Anyway, we're just going to hear more and more and more about the U.S. And then people are going to have to start thinking about what the repercussions are for Canada and the U.S. if Trump is able to get reelected.
So if politics wasn't on the discussion agenda around the New Year's dinner table conversation, I think that's kind of refreshing. What was? What are the economic or sort of public affairs or current affairs stories that you think are really bubbling up for people at the moment?
So I don't think electoral politics was on people's minds, but I definitely think economics were on people's minds. Affordability. Every time I went to the supermarket, right, you just go in to grab one thing and the bill was like,
Yeah.
Like the bill was like $130 and I was just going in to pick up one thing. And, so people who are trying to raise a big family and stuff, every time I checked out, I thought, wow, how are people doing it? How am I doing it? How are other people
I
doing
really
it?
noticed it, especially as I was cooking for, I think, Christmas Eve dinner. We hosted about 20 or 25 people at my place. And, you really notice the grocery bill when you're cooking for a big group or baking for a big group.
Well, I have to confess, all I had to do was make Brussels sprouts for Christmas dinner. and I was like, wow, like Brussels sprouts. Of course, I got to put some bacon and some maple syrup in there. But yeah, so affordability is very much on people's minds. If you look back on 2023, if you take sort of the election out of the scenario, the number one thing people were thinking about was affordability. And I think it's a big reason why the election turned out the way that it did.
Mm-hmm. So affordability still, would you say, is that probably number one with a bullet in the minds of Albertans as the top issue of concern? How burning is that affordability issue at the moment?
Yeah, so every so often I like to start a survey with what are the most important issues facing the province right now. And every time I ask that question in 2023, affordability was number one, and healthcare was number two, and then sort of a distant third would be things like education and housing and that sort of thing. But I don't think we talked a lot about healthcare in the past year. We'll talk about it a lot more given the healthcare reforms I think the government is looking towards this year. But yeah, it's affordability with a bullet, but don't think that social policies still aren't on people's minds too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll pick up on one of those you brought up, a little bit further down the list are issues like housing and other things that I think both sort of bridge social and economic policy in some ways. I think that public opinions, or at least public discussion around immigration and migration really changed in the past year or so, and perhaps nowhere more than in Alberta that is experiencing the highest population growth and in-migration of anywhere in the country. What are Albertan attitudes like at the moment to all the new Albertans that are coming into this province?
Well, immigration is such a fascinating issue because, if I do a poll and I ask people what's important at a provincial level, immigration is probably not going to come up. It's more likely to come up if I were to ask them about federal issues. But even though it doesn't come up as a top of mind issue, that issue of immigration touches on so many other issues, right? Housing is the main one, but also healthcare. I mean, people come to this province, they need to access healthcare. They need to access the education system. So immigration is affecting the population in many, many ways. So attitudes are starting to shift around immigration, and particularly not that Albertans or Canadians are anti-immigration, but they're starting to question conditions under which we accept immigrants and how to use immigration as an economic driver rather than an economic drag.
Yeah, I think we're at this important moment around immigration newcomer policy, because for most of my life, there's been this broad across the political spectrum consensus that immigration is an overwhelming good for Canada. And I believe it always has been and always will be. With the record numbers of newcomers that we're seeing, though, I think that you're seeing a lot more discussion about how do we do this right? How do we make sure that we have enough houses for people, enough schools for their children, enough doctors, and I think there's a growing sense that we need to think more about absorptive capacity and how we sort of accommodate all these new folks that are coming. And from an Alberta context, that's not necessarily immigration, that's even just migration, the record numbers of people moving here. Tell me how you sort of take that. Am I on the right track or off the right track in terms of how Albertans are thinking about this?
Absolutely. And I think I read this in the BCA report on immigration that, almost all of Canada's population growth is coming from immigration. We would have a stagnant population without immigration. So it is critical to keep the economy growing. I think when it comes to immigration, still Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, they're the big magnets for international immigration. Here in Alberta, we're getting some of that international immigration, but it's really interprovincial immigration that is driving our economy right now. So it feels like we're struggling with the weight of all of these newcomers. But we're not struggling as much as other parts of Canada, right? It's still more affordable. And, other parts of Canada are figuring out how they're going to deal with migration. Meanwhile, Alberta is running ad campaigns in other parts of Canada. So yes, we're struggling with in-migration, but at the same time, government's promoting it. And I hear rumors that Alberta's calling campaign may be coming back in some new version.
I've heard similar rumors, yeah. And we still need lots of folks in Alberta's economy. We need to sort of do it in the right way so that those newcomers can be as successful as they want to be. Okay, so we've talked about a little bit about immigration and a little bit about affordability, which I want to touch on some more, but you mentioned healthcare. So let's go there for a moment, which is a topic that we perhaps don't talk as often about as a business organization, but you said you think that this is going to come up more this year. Where are Albertans at on healthcare?
Well, the government has promised healthcare reform. Of course, coming out of the pandemic, our premier was one of the biggest critics of our healthcare system, Alberta Health Services, and one of her big campaign promises was to blow up AHS. So what we saw was the beginning of this reorganization at the end of last year. The government announced that they're going to sort of take AHS and turn it into, take one big pillar that was AHS, and they're going to create 4 slightly smaller pillars. But I think a lot of the people who voted for Danielle Smith in the UCP leadership, who voted for the UCP in the provincial election, I think they thought she was promising with healthcare reform was more local control, right? So it seems like we got more pillars. We didn't get more layers, if you sort of follow me there, right? So I'm just wondering, are these 4 pillars? I think if I remember correctly, healthcare and addiction, long-term care, continuing care, primary care, and acute care. Those are the 4 areas. So now what I'm starting to wonder is there more reform coming? I haven't heard this as a rumor, but I've heard this as an idea, is locally elected healthcare boards and more control at the local level. So I think the UCP base is going to be looking for more in terms of healthcare reform, but maybe the majority of Albertans are going to be nervous at the kind of healthcare reform that the base is itching for.
And that's because you're saying the type of reform that the base wants is you're sort of referring to as the base, is that more localized control. How about Albertans more broadly? What do they want? If their healthcare system is going to be reformed, what do broad Albertans want to see from it?
If healthcare reform was a successful tool for improving healthcare, we would have improved healthcare 10 times over because we reformed the system enough. If reform was the answer, we would know that it was working. So I don't think Albertans are looking for reform. They're looking for key measures of improvement, right? And how we get there is another question. But when you ask Albertans what they're worried about, it's wait times, it's getting a family doctor, right? So I think when the new reorganization of Alberta Health Services was announced, a lot of Albertans looked at that and just kind of said, like, okay, fine. How does this get me a family doctor? Okay, fine. How does this get long-term care facility in my little town? Okay, fine. What happens if my nephew has a mental health crisis? Help me understand. So those are the things I think Albertans are worried about service delivery. And I mean, Scott, you and I have known each other forever, right? and over the years, we talked about healthcare, we've talked about education. And I think one of the things that you and I have always talked about is when you ask Albertans in a focus group or in a survey about healthcare, you need to distinguish whether you're talking about the delivery of healthcare or the administration of healthcare. Like those are right. So when you ask
the delivery being the people that they would meet in their healthcare interactions, their doctors, nurses, or other healthcare
exactly.
professionals.
So if you ask people about their last experience with the healthcare system, most people actually will tell you that they had a great experience, but they'll also sort of preface that with, I was really lucky. Right? And when you ask them about the administration of healthcare, they tear their hairs out. Oh, it's horrible. It's awful. So, the administration of healthcare, I don't think Albertans have much of an opinion on. What they really want is answers on the delivery of care.
So you've mentioned a couple times now the election. We're now a few quarters past the provincial election. Give us your sort of view and the view of Albertans on the provincial government at the moment. How they're doing it. What are the big, most important issues that Albertans are looking for them to tackle as they probably table a budget in the relatively near future here?
Well, as I was driving over here, I thought, I should probably re-listen to last year's podcast to see if I need to take any of my predictions back. But probably in last year's podcast, I was preparing people for the inevitability of an NDP government. Because that's how it felt a year ago, right? Danielle Smith had been elected leader of the UCP, but the average Albertan Albertan was quite concerned about her policies, about her ideas. You know, a lot of people were thinking, oh, what did the UCP do? And if you had asked Albertans, not how they were going to vote, if you asked them who they thought was going to win the next election, most Albertans were getting themselves prepared for an NDP government. But what happened? Well, my polling suggests that the world turned upside down on right after Easter weekend. So I had the NDP ahead, and then lo and behold, right after Easter weekend, I had the UCP ahead. And I wasn't sure I should trust that poll until I did another one. And I took a lot of flack for my final election predictions, but it was actually the fourth poll in a row that I had done that showed the same numbers, right? Some of them I had made public, some of them hadn't. I had a little bit of insurance in my back pocket before I made a big prediction.
And for anyone who didn't follow your numbers that closely, what did your numbers say?
So I had 52.44 for the election outcome. It was 52.644. So I missed it by 0.6.
But there is another election that you've called correctly and well within the margin of error.
Thank you. Anyway, so I saw things shift on Easter weekend. What was important about Easter weekend? Well, if you remember, I think it was like the Monday or the Tuesday after Easter was that big press conference where the Premier stood in front of Calgary City Council. She had all of Calgary City Council behind her, and she announced the arena deal. Now, what I heard in my own research was that people weren't sure that was a good deal, but she got it done. Well, she gets things done. I don't know if it's a good deal, but she got something done when nobody else did. And then it was almost like the writ didn't drop until the 1st of May, but the UCP started making campaign-style announcements one after another. And I think that it won a lot of voters over. And they sort of said, well, I still have my concerns. I'm still worried. But I see the UCP as a party that's coming up with ideas, that's doing things. And there was this frustration that the NDP was just focused on Danielle Smith and not enough focus on other policies. So we get a UCP government. And what I'm seeing in my polling right now is that the UCP is having that sort of honeymoon that we always expect from a new government, right? We elected them, whether you had your doubts when they were elected or not. Albertans are kind of in that, let's give them a chance. Let's see what they're going to do. So I don't get any sense from my polling that people who voted for the UCP are changing their mind or anything right now. So we're kind of in this wait and see mode right now. The other thing that's working in the UCP's favor, and I think the reason that their honeymoon is continuing, is because we don't know what's happening with the NDP. It looks like Rachel Notley's going to step aside and there's going to be an NDP leadership race. So it's hard to do polling when you don't know who the future leaders of a party is going to be. It's hard for voters to say, I'm behind the NDP, till they know who the leader of the NDP is going to be. When Jason Kenney won the election in 2019, Rachel Notley said, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be your worst nightmare. I'm going to be the strongest opposition leader this province has ever had. And she was part of the formula that made it so difficult for Jason Kenney to govern. And Danielle Smith doesn't have that problem. She doesn't have, Notley's not buzzing around her the way Notley was buzzing around Kenney.
Mm-hmm. Let me just ask you a little bit more about that, because you've brought up the official opposition, the New Democrats. We don't often talk a lot about opposition parties because they're not in a position to dictate a lot of policy. But tell us what you expect from the opposition in 2024 and what Albertans maybe do as well. What are they looking for from New Democrats? I know you've been asking some of these questions lately.
Sure. I mean, I completely expect that Notley's going to step down. I'll be very surprised if she doesn't. So what we're all going to see in the next few months is an NDP leadership race. And why that's interesting is because the NDP have never really had a leadership race that the public paid much attention to, a race that had much scrutiny. So I remember, this is a Graham Thompson story that Brian Mason once told Graham Thompson. It was one of those years where the Progressive Conservatives were having a leadership review, and like Ralph Klein got 98% support in the leadership review, and Graham said he was at the convention. He goes back to Edmonton and he finds out that the NDP had a leadership review on the same weekend. And he said, oh, Brian, I wish I knew. I would have covered it. And Brian Mason said, well, our leadership reviews are a little bit different than the PCs. We sit around the table and we say, you do it. No, you do it. Well, that's not the NDP party. I mean, right, Rachel Notley has turned the NDP into something completely different. This will be a hotly contested leadership race. We're already seeing some big names coming forward thinking about running. So this is going to be a very interesting race. I mean, the NDP didn't win the last election, but they still are a party that, hypothetically could win. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to watch. And leaders define a party to such a great extent. It's going to be really interesting to see who ends up as leader and what that does to the party and Albertans' perceptions of the party.
So let's go back to a key policy plank of the provincial government, which has been sort of a pushback strategy against much of what the federal government has been trying to do, particularly on energy and environment policy. The provincial government scored a couple of, what they would view as pretty big wins around Bill C-69 and the plastics ban. We were interveners, actually, the Business Council, on the C-69 issue. Do you think that that is a strategy that we will see more of from Danielle Smith and her government this year? And how is that resonating or not with Albertans?
Well, I think it is resonating. I think, Alberta premiers love having in their back pocket the ability to fight with Ottawa. It's always a good provincial strategy. And right now, with the lack of popularity of the Trudeau government, it's a really good strategy right now. So I think the reason that the UCP's numbers are as good as they are right now is because actually Albertans are enjoying the fight that Danielle Smith is picking with the federal government by and large. So, let's not forget, Danielle Smith is doing some pretty controversial things right now. Talk about the Alberta pension plan not playing well with Albertans. Changes to the healthcare system. Albertans are not quite sure what to make of that. But fights with the federal government, Albertans are liking those things. So one thing that the Premier has done is she's promised to invoke the Sovereignty Act if the government follows through with its net zero for the electricity grid by 2035. And funny enough, a year ago when we were asking people what they thought of Danielle Smith's plan to introduce a Sovereignty Act, most Albertans said that sounds like a pretty crazy idea. And now that people are seeing her say, well, this is how I'm going to use the Sovereignty Act. I'm going to use the Sovereignty Act to push back on, net zero electricity 2023. And a bare majority of Albertans are saying like, oh, okay, I like using it that way.
So attitudes on that particular policy have shifted. If we were to look at sort of the broad package of policies that all fit under this category, so you could put in things like electric vehicle mandates, clean electricity regulations, clean fuel regulations, oil and gas emissions caps, methane emissions caps, I would argue almost all of which fall disproportionately on Alberta, for better or for worse. How are Albertans, I have a good sense of how the Premier views many of those policies. How are Albertans viewing that sort of package of policies that the federal government has rolled out over roughly the last year?
Well, when it comes to environmental policies, sometimes we forget that Albertans can walk and chew gum at the same time. Albertans can care about the environment, but also care about jobs and the energy sector and that sort of thing. So I think Albertans want to move forward with regulations that's truly going to help the environment, right? One of the big events in 2023 we didn't talk about was the fires, right?
Worst fire season on record for Canada.
It's a bad stereotype to say that Albertans don't care about the environment. They do care about the environment, but they also care about jobs. So it's threading that needle. And I think there's a risk for the government if they go too hard against environmental policy. Yeah, I think there's a risk for them. But at the same time, Albertans do see it as the job of the provincial government to protect our economic interests.
What do you think we'll see playing out this year in federal politics?
Well, I think we're always wondering, do we have a federal election on the horizon or not? And I'm thinking no, because right now there's a coalition between the Liberals and the NDP. I don't see how it's in either one of those parties' advantage to have an election right now. And if it's not to your advantage, you're not going to call an election. I also think the specter of a U.S. presidential election, right? Even if the U.S. presidential election didn't have a lot of impact on the federal election, if I'm planning out an election strategy, and I go, on day one we got to do this, and on day two we got to do this, man, you don't want the risk of like Trump, interrupting. So I just politically don't think it's going to happen. But let's say in a universe where Janet Brown's making a wrong prediction, we do have a federal election, then I think, the polling would suggest that it's very likely that the Conservatives would win. Let's not forget, polling suggested the NDP was going to win provincially a few months ahead of the election. But okay, let's say Poilievre wins. That changes the dynamic a lot for Danielle Smith. Right. And so the gold she's mining right now with her fights with the federal government, suddenly she can't rely on that anymore.
So we did go back and listen to last year's podcast and your predictions for what we'd be talking about throughout 2023 and what we might be sitting down talking about today were primarily inflation and affordability. And so I want to ask you, how do you feel about those predictions? Were those defining characteristics of last year for you? And same question again for this year. When we sit down, hopefully you'll do this with us another year from now. What stories do you think will be, what policies or what stories will be defining 2024?
Okay, well, I didn't go back and listen to it, so I'm relieved that those were my predictions. And yes, I think affordability was that issue overlaying the provincial election that gave us the outcome that we got, right? I think Albertans were sort of saying, I don't want to mess with the economy, and I've got my concerns about Danielle Smith, but I've also got greater concerns with the NDP and the economy. So I do think affordability and the economy definitely were those issues. So going forward, now here's what I'm sort of seeing in my polling is that people have stopped talking about the causes and now they're talking about the symptoms.
Like inflation is not the word that everyone's talking about quite the same way anymore. It's more the sort of downstream symptoms.
Right. So now people are talking about inflation. Now they're talking more specifically about housing, right? People are talking less about homelessness and more about crime, right? So now I sort of see people are starting to really sort of feel the impact of, so now I think it's the knock-on effect of a long-term affordability crisis and a long-term inflationary crisis. Now, and be interested to hear what economists you have on in the next few weeks say, but we got like mortgages that are coming up for renewal and those sorts of things. So that's what I'm seeing is people are more focused on what is this affordability crisis doing to my family, what's it doing to my neighborhood, what's it doing to my city.
A little more when how the rubber hits the road. It's interesting that you mentioned mortgages up for renewal. We were just talking to some of our economists yesterday who are working on a piece on that right now. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out. Some of the short story is we haven't necessarily seen as much impact of high interest rates yet as we maybe thought we would. How are Albertans feeling about their financial situation?
So that's interesting. I kind of ask a two-part question. I ask people just, tell me about your own personal financial situation, and now tell me how you feel about the economy, right? So we don't actually see the numbers change very much in terms of how people feel about their own financial situation. And that's because most people earn a salary and the salary's the same week after week and your mortgage payment's the same month after month. So we're not seeing that people are necessarily recording a big change in their own personal situation, but they are becoming far more concerned about the economy in general. So I think what I'm seeing in the numbers right now is people are saying, we're hanging on, my family's coping, but I'm anxious about our ability to hang on in the future.
So, Janet, we've reached nearly our time here. I'll ask you, kind of wrap it all together for me. We started off by saying public opinion matters, whether you're planning policy, politics, or running a business. What would be a thought that you would leave our listeners with as they make their strategic plans for 2024 or begin to execute their strategic plans perhaps for 2024, how they could be aligned with the attitudes of Albertans?
Right. So I think about your audience as a business audience, obviously, right? And after the election was over, everybody I ran into said, what are you going to do next year? How are you, what does a pollster do when it's not an
Take
election
the year off.
and so what I've actually been reminding my clients is there is a natural 4-year cycle, right? And we pay a lot of attention to politics in the year leading up to an election. But what I'm telling my clients is these next 2 years from a policy point of view are critical. This is what we call the activist zone of a government. They're in their honeymoon period. They can actually afford to make a few mistakes. They can afford to do some controversial things. Think about why we're talking about the Alberta pension plan now, because it's early in the government cycle. So what I'm saying to my clients is, if you want to impact policy, if you want to impact government, don't think of these as the sleepy days of government. Think of these as the most active time in government. So I'm not going to be doing a lot of horse race polling over the next year, but I will be doing a lot of polling sort of associated with policy changes, right? Clients are going to come to me and say, can you ask people what they think about this? So that we can take this to government and say, look, people would like us to change insurance in this way. They would like us to change healthcare in this way. They would like us to change the education system in this way. So that's what my year is going to be about, helping my clients impact policy development.
Well, we sure love policy, and a message that these aren't the sleepy years, these are the activist years is a perfect note to leave it on. Thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief. This is an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta. You can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.